Hello, I'm Mark Costello, originally from Ireland, but now based at Nord University in Norway. And thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about my experience with marine protected areas, or marine reserves as they're also called when they're no take. So my background is that I did my PhD in a marine reserve, and then I eventually ended up working in New Zealand right next door to a marine reserve where we remapped all its habitats and looked at the change in habitats over time due to protection. And I taught a master's course in marine protected areas there for nearly 16 years. And I also managed a Facebook page on marine reserves where I post at least one message per day, every day, about MPAs. And more recently, I've begun coordinating a project in Europe called MPA Europe, which is going to design an optimal network of marine protected areas in Europe, which is very much like the strategy that you're using in Israel to record, to document where the optimal places to protect marine biodiversity in this Israeli exclusive economic zone. So in this talk, I'll talk a little bit about what protection means, and if partial protection works, if MPA are expensive or radical, and if MPAs can be a benchmark for sustainable fisheries and ocean management, because certainly they can't be considered in isolation from the wider issues of management in the oceans. They're part of it. And I think it's reasonable for the public when we hear that a place is a protected area, that wildlife is not hunted and killed there. And you'd expect as well that countries would be obliged to use the IUCN categories for what protected means. And thus the database that they host, the World Database on Protected Areas, would be listing only areas that are protected. But in fact, if we look at this graph here, which is a couple of years, I could update it a little bit more, but the pattern is still the same. So we see a widening gap between areas in the database that are aimed to be fully protected versus are fully protected. So there's well over 9,000 places called marine protected areas, but only 6% by number aim to fully protect nature. And this accounts for only about 3% of the ocean area aims to be in a natural condition. And that's from the mpaatlas.org, who verify the status of places that are called marine protected areas. But now countries have agreed under the Convention on Biological Diversity for within their areas of control, and under the United Nations Law of the Sea, the Draft High Seas Agreement also calls for 30% of the high seas to be protected by 2030. Another way of counting this would be to look at how many countries have marine reserves or no-take MPA, and well over half of the coastal countries have no marine reserves that are no-take, including my native Ireland and many other countries that you would expect would. And so there's lots of kind of misunderstandings, I think, in the conversation about marine protected areas. And people think the idea is radical, but I'll argue it's not. It's radical maybe extending what we do normally on land into the ocean. And it's also that only commercial fishing impacts biodiversity. Commercial fishing always seems to be the one that is asked to restrict its activities, but not other kinds of fishing. And people also wonder, well, do MPAs benefit pelagic species because they can float and swim and fly over large areas of the ocean, and that is expensive. But MPAs are not radical. It's very common for us on land to set aside area for public benefits in schools, hospitals, universities, roads, and so on, and national parks. So why don't we do it in the ocean a little bit more? And there's also a misunderstanding sometimes that marine protected areas exclude the public, but the opposite is the case. And the first marine reserve in New Zealand, which is at where our marine laboratory is, they created a marine reserve there thinking that the people would stay away, because if the people couldn't go fishing, nobody would come. But in fact, the opposite happened, because people discovered that the abundance of fish and lobsters and other life in the area was just extraordinary, and they could walk amongst them and swim and scuba dive and view them. And people enjoyed it so much that all over New Zealand, we now have 44 marine reserves because people wanted them. Having seen one that was so successful, people went home to their hometowns and they wanted one too. And it's not only commercial fishing that impacts ecosystems, and I explained the ecological reason for this, but subsistence fishing impacts have been recorded in the archaeological evidence since the Stone Age. And here are some examples from Africa, Europe, and the Caribbean. And the reason is that because, in contrast to land where we tend to eat herbivores, in the ocean we eat the top predators first. So people kill the tuna, the salmon, and other large organisms. Well, we've already killed many of the marine mammals as well, some of which would be high on this food chain. So when you remove the top predators, they impact all the other species in the food web below them. So those other species become more abundant without predation, and it changes the whole food web and the ecosystem as a consequence. And this pattern is called trophic cascades. The example here is for cod, where you have a lot of cod. They prey on small fish, crab and shrimp, so their abundance is lower. And if that trophic level has low abundance, then the next trophic level has a high abundance, so the zooplankton are larger. And if large-bodied zooplankton graze phytoplankton, so we end up with less phytoplankton, and so on. It even affects the nitrates. And I'll give some examples of these. So in the marine reserve in New Zealand, and in fact, all the marine reserves in New Zealand, they assumed when some were being created in the 1970s and 80s that the ocean there was in a relatively natural condition. And it wasn't until 20 years later we discovered that in fact it wasn't, that there already had been a trophic cascade, but nobody noticed. And even the scientists debated this for several years, but it was proven by repeated observations in different places and by experiments that indeed large fish and lobsters controlled sea urchins, these which I'm sure you're aware of, these spiny sea urchins. And without these sea urchins being controlled, they graze the rocks bare, so you then lose all the seaweed and the kelp habitat. And this pattern of sea urchin seaweed trophic cascades is very common all around the world, from not just New Zealand, Tasmania, but the Mediterranean, Kenya, Africa, Alaska, and North America. And as you're probably aware, people have been fishing since the 1950s. They've been fishing deeper in the ocean for both pelagic and demersal, which are near seabed species. And this has been going on down to thousands of meters now. And what happens when this fishing happens, this is examples of pelagic fish. And you'll notice that the blue marlin in blue is fished first because it's the largest and most valuable species. Then we have the white marlin is fished and its catch increases and so on. So what happens is the fisheries target the largest species and then they move down through the food chain, replacing one species with another. And this also happened in the Northwest Atlantic with the demise of the cod fisheries. Now this graph is a little bit complicated, but in short, what happens is the overfishing of the groundfish, which are largely cod, but also haddock and some other species. And they had noticed an increase in seals as well. This might have had an effect. But then there's an increase in the species that normally they preyed on, the pelagic fish, shrimp and crabs. And there's an increase in the larvae of these crustaceans. And these larvae increase in abundance. These are larvae of shrimp and crabs and lobsters, and they predate cod larvae. So now the system has changed where crustaceans in the plankton are actually limiting the recovery of the cod populations. And this trophic cascade is actually visible right down to the phytoplankton and zooplankton, where, as I mentioned before, the zooplankton are grazing less, so we end up with more phytoplankton, and with increasing phytoplankton growth, there's less free nitrate in the water. So you can see these cascades right through ecosystems. So we should expect these in the future and not be surprised by them. And this is kind of a summary of it here. So we do have pelagic ecosystem cascades, as I just explained in the cod example, with pelagic fish, and we also see benthic ecosystem trophic cascades. And partially protected MPAs don't work. Several were created in New Zealand in the early days because it was sort of a compromise with recreational fisheries. So the commercial fisheries were banned, but recreation were allowed. But recreational fisheries largely do the same thing. And very quickly they remove all the largest fish and largest lobsters in an area. And in fact, the problem is that these partly protected areas become a magnet for fishermen, for amateur recreational fishermen, because they assume that because there's no commercial fishing, there'll be more fish. So you end up having increased fishing in these areas. And the same has happened in Norway, where I'm living now. We have a local marine reserve, which actually has a fishing camp right in the middle of it. And they attract tourists in from overseas because they say it's a marine protected area. There's no commercial fishing. So there should be more fish for tourists. So this is kind of the opposite of what is the idea behind having a protected area. So this means that there's no ecological benefits in protected areas. And one might ask, do they have social benefits? Well, there's a really nice study just out this year, or was it perhaps late last year, in conservation biology, where they did a survey of people in southern Australia, inside and outside partly protected and fully protected areas. And I quote from them here. But in short, because people don't perceive any benefit to partly protected areas because they can catch fish there as they can in the unprotected areas. So the only areas that are unanimously beneficial ecologically and socially are those areas that are fully protected because they have something unique, which is an abundance of large fish and commercially fish, and the ecosystem is accordingly different. And it also seems fairer because it seems a little inequitable sometimes to exclude one kind of fishermen for another kind of fishermen. And this is a human centered view of what the impact of fishing, because obviously the fish don't care who kills them. It's all the same to them. And MPAs aren't expensive because the only reason MPAs have a new cost is when there's been no management in the ocean already. But we should be managing the ocean everywhere to some extent in a balanced way. And if we are already managing it and we simplify the management to no fishing, for example, or you can do this and that and not the other, well, then this is actually a simpler form of management. It should be easier to regulate. And in fact, I can't find any evidence, and we've polled an email list with 12,000 people that work in MPAs, and we've asked them, is there any evidence that marine protected areas are a cost to any fisheries anywhere? And we can't find any evidence that this is the case. There are a number of reasons why it might be the case. And there are numerous papers expecting it to be a cost, and they talk about fisheries displacement and loss of fisheries. But in fact, all the evidence is that fisheries actually benefit within a few years from the increased abundance of fish. So any country can have marine reserves. In fact, many of the countries with the biggest marine reserves are in developing countries, including the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, and some now in the Southern Atlantic Ocean. Here's a map of what they call the large-scale MPAs, outlined in red here. And you can see where they're located. And what some of these island nations have actually done is, because they lack the resources to police their exclusive economic zone using ships, instead they use satellites and record the movements of ships. But they have flipped the conventional management of their ocean area to what is normally done on land, which is that everything is protected, and if you want to do something, you need to get a permit. So they're now operating on the precautionary principle, which is exactly what other countries all over the world have agreed to do under the United Nations Law of the Sea and under the Convention on Biological Diversity, but they actually don't do it when it comes to the ocean. So we need to just change our management thinking to be protecting ocean life in the first case before we start utilizing it. And here's a recent example. There are many examples from coastal marine reserves of increased fishery abundance, and several where they've documented spillover, including Lee Marine Reserve, where I worked. But I picked this example because it's the first one for benefits to pelagic species, which was surprising because the pelagic species are so mobile and most marine reserves are so small that it's hard to detect the difference between the fishery catch inside and outside because they could be the same fish passing through. But here, this is the Hawaiian, the large reserve off the northwest of Hawaii, and these are pelagic tuna and other billfish. And the maps here show on the left show the area that's protected and the zones outside it, the near zone and the far zone. And on the right, they have a time scale going from 2010 to 2018, and the area was declared a marine reserve around 2016. And you can see this boost in fisheries in the area near and to a lesser extent in the area further away from the protected area. So exactly as has been observed in coastal areas, fish are probably not as mobile as we thought, and they probably are a little bit more residential, and they may even change their behavior like birds do to stay in places where they know they're safer and avoid places where they know they're hunted. Okay. So this diagram here, this infographic, is based on a literature review. Myself and Tamlin Jefferson, my former PhD student, have been working on a review of the literature on benefits. And it just shows that the benefits to fisheries with increasing marine protection, and we can't find any downside to this. And fisheries, in any case, in most countries, need to limit their capacity and limit their fishing in some way for more sustainable fishing, which they already know. And marine protected areas provide a very good support complementary mechanism. But marine protected areas then also protect biodiversity, and they allow the food webs and ecosystem to be in a more natural condition. So then we learn what is a natural ecosystem should look like. And that's something we have no idea about in Europe and probably the North Atlantic and most parts of the world, because fishing has been happening for several hundred years. And we also need to think about all the other stakeholders. And in fact, marine reserves are beneficial to the majority of the stakeholder groups, the public, education, scientists, future generations for recreation, and they may even be complementary to energy generation and aquaculture in moderation. And this picture is at Lee Marine Reserve. This is the most amazing snorkeling program that's run in New Zealand that has now tens of thousands of children and adults have joined, and they go snorkeling inside and outside marine reserves, and they see the difference. So you don't need any more science to explain to these people what the benefits of marine reserves are. And in the background is a glass bottom boat run by a former fisherman and his wife. So when I think back on what were the benefits of marine areas, and this is through my lens as a scientist, they are a safe haven for threatened and economically important species. And this also, of course, benefits coastal communities and traditional cultures who may have a tradition of feasting on a particular species at particular times of the year. So it supports their cultural traditions. They also, because you have to involve local communities in this, because it's a local initiative, maybe more offshore, one has to think differently. But it also helps them manage their local resources. And that's why when I had friends that created some of the marine protected areas in Indonesia, and they would go to various villages and they would talk to them about this idea of having marine reserves. And they said that in many cases you're only there for a few minutes and people understood exactly what it meant. They said, oh yes, we fully understand. We do this already on a temporary basis. So even a temporary basis, the new marine reserve in the Ross Sea is temporary. It's 25 years. It's dedicated for, and then it'll be reconsidered, which is an interesting idea because it means another generation will then decide on whether that Ross Sea marine protected area was a benefit and should be modified or in any way. But I digress. So I think as a scientist, one of the most interesting things from these marine reserves was that suddenly we now realized what were the effects of fishing not just the direct effect of fishing on the species, but the effect on the food webs and the whole ecosystem. And we would never have known this without some no-take marine reserves. And also, if no-take marine reserves are accessible to the public, then the public will see them and then they will understand why they're beneficial, and they will understand what natural, flourishing marine life looks like. And this is quite normal to set aside areas for the public good. So thank you very much, and I will wish you the best in your deliberations and in figuring out how to best manage the Israeli exclusive economic zone. Thank you.